very hard that I fought very hard that that is not so expensive. So it's so they asked the publisher asked me to do an edition, and because of that, what I will do today is I have developed a new cognitive mapping exercise, I call it, which I will ask you at the end as an exercise I give you, and I will talk about that later. But the perk here is, if you do this exercise and the exercise is really good, we'll select with Nadia, then this exercise will end up in the new edition of my book and can be published, which normally I've always used our local students, but we are more than happy to also have our Guelph students participate in the book. Now, before I start, here's the title: Visualization Multisensorial Sight Perception. Visualizing it. The reason why I'm doing this lecture is I argue that landscape architects and architects are not enough engaged in the analysis of a project because of the process of designing that is at the front end of the design process. Before we do the preliminary design, we go on site, we visit, we understand it, we touch it, we taste it, we sniff it. We may not eat it, but we go there and investigate. And I found over my career, before I was a professor, I had an office in an international firm in Berlin and in Shanghai in China for 15 years, practicing that. Because of the construction drawings and the site management and the client engagement, we do not do enough at the front end. Now with AI coming in, a lot of these tedious works can partially be reduced, that work, because of the AI. So it can help us as an agent to do a lot of the work, which means we can do more at the front end. And I argue that we should be doing visual multisensorial sight perception. In the old days, in the 80s, when I was a student, it was visual literacy only. So it was only the sight they were interested in. But I argued the other four senses, touch, taste, smell, and sound, should also be engaged. And these are some of the first drawings you can see here on the date. When I write a book, I normally visualize it and draw it first. So I thought I'd show you a little bit how the book came together. Then I give you a short lecture, very short, also on the book itself, show you some interesting images and the inspiration behind it. But first, a little bit of the theory and why we are doing this. I also argue, and this is why I want you to learn the axonometric, the cube method, which you can see here are the links already. Nadia has those links. That also has now an AI plugin. So an AI app is added to this method since I first taught this at Guelph. So there's a lot for you to look at. But let's dive in. I'm just going to press the button here of my iPad. Let's dive in. Most important is the design process. And this is from my book. There's a lot of things happening. And I argue, and you can see it's a iterating process. It's not linear, it goes back and forth. You doubt, you have questions, and you can see the first one is the important one, sight immersion. And here is where I argue multisensorial sight immersion, not just using the eye, is important. Smell of the sight, the touch, the wind of the sight, touching your skin, that's actually touch. The bodily experience with the sight. And then how do we record it? All those things are important. And I argue we need to go to sight much more, even when we teach students, educate them. So we should be not going to sight once, we should go to sight multiple times. And then we record it. Obviously, we can record now with the phone, audio, we can record drawings, we can record text, and then we do the analysis and synthesize this. And then we have the ideation process. And ideation comes from the Greek word edein, to see. So ideas is basically a Greek word meaning, here are my ideas, I'm visualizing them. And then we do the final design. And I think this is a lot of the time where people are not aware. And I argue in the design process that this is a multisensorial experience, as you can see here in that little image. So and the whole book is set up with these icons of these 5 senses. and how they engage with the landscape. And I argue when you visit a site, this is somewhere, a dream landscape somewhere in the Okanagan or somewhere in British Columbia, you need to be fully embodied in the site and really understand it deeply. And that brings me to the site immersion. Basically, the site immersion is key for a rigorous multisensory landscape and environmental diagnostics. I argue, like when you go to the doctor, today they just sit on the computer and type and ask you what's wrong with you. In the old days, they touched you, felt you, smelled you, and knew what was going to go on. They don't do that anymore. And I argue we as designers are like doctors. We have to analyze the landscape to be really strong and good designers. And that is, and how we record this in the book, I've developed this, this sort of a page matrix here, which shows you the recording tools for the different senses, and then what and how you can visualize them. And then there are obviously also examples. But it is important for you to get this idea and spend some time. The book is downloadable as ebook or in your library, I know, because you have it there. But I think it is an important part. And then recently, virtual reality and AI obviously is a really good step in the right direction, because a lot, but it still relies on just sight and audio. But it does help, for example, to teach a client to walk through a park, through a site. It will be actually quite effective. But what it doesn't do, and that's why you have to go on site, touch, smell, and taste, that cannot be done digitally yet. There are now robots who can see. There are electric noses which can smell the food, for example. But what the problem is, the robot who sees you cannot see the emotions. They can see that you smile, but they don't know, is it a sympathetic smile? Is it a smile because of a joke? Is it whatever the smile is? So that the robot can't see. It can only see that you smile. And that emotional touch, that is also what AI cannot do. And that's why I'm doing currently the edits. I'm writing another chapter where I argue there are certain things the artificial intelligence cannot do. And I read a lot of papers about robotics and other tools which are now available. But this interconnection, I give you another example. You smell something like a bakery and it brings you back when you were a child in your country and you had to buy the bread for your parents. Robots, AI can't know that. And that is initiated by the smell you are having. So smell is memory, a really important aspect. So this observation is a cognitive act in your brain, hearing, taste, touch, smelling, and seeing. And the perception is the synthesis of those memories and emotions and feelings. And they work together to make that experience. So if you go to a restaurant, it's the experience of the restaurant. Is it acoustically nice? Often they are now sparse, so they're too loud. You can't even talk to each other, so not so good. Maybe carpets or curtains would help. But there are lots of things which they have removed now because it may not be so hipster, but actually from a point of audio, it would be better to have that. Then there is the smell of the food, and then and then there's the taste of the food, and will bring you back. And that sensorial experience, how do we document that? And how do we make that available? So it's an analytical process. And this is why I made this diagram. Here's a landscape. I left out the taste because if there wasn't an apple tree or something, obviously you shouldn't be eating the dirt. But you can see this is kind of the setup. And then when you look at it, this is how it interacts, how the responses of the physical act of the senses then is computed in your brain. And then there is the synthesis, the emotions, the feelings, and that a robot, a machine cannot represent. Not yet, anyway, even though they're saying. Because it's in your head. You can't, if you don't compute it anywhere, they can't know. So the machine doesn't know that, so it cannot relate to these memories. And that's what makes it so interesting and I found so important. So from when you design and analyze the senses, let's start with something very simple. Let's start with some fruit and some food, and even at the bottom there's a chair. But the idea here is we run it through the 5 senses, and then we could describe it. And you can see with the banana, maybe the sound, there isn't a sound. But with the potato chips, actually the manufacturers create them that it makes a crunch. Not just that it tastes good, it has to make a crunch. So it's also an advertising thing. And the wooden chair, obviously you won't eat it. So it makes, but it gives you a sense. So that's one way we could describe the senses. And then you could go up in scale for gardens, different kinds of gardens, medieval gardens, even an arid ecosystem like the desert, vegetable garden, and then you can do the same. So again, this is an intellectual exercise classifying the what happens with the senses. And I have written multiple articles. This is one I wrote for a Chinese landscape peer-reviewed journal with a Chinese researcher and one former student. And that is about sense-walk mapping. And these articles then inspired my write-up of the book, which Nadia will obviously give you a link to look at. But what is important here is that I used the sense-walk mapping to investigate. And we used it in historic Chinese gardens, going through these gardens and then categorizing soundscape, smellscape, touchscape, and tastescape. Because I argue we can't just look at the site. That's just too simplistic. It is a much more complex process. And you can see here, then when we went through the different gardens we looked at in China, we looked at the different sensation types. And then we obviously described, first of all, what the experiences are. And then we looked at maps. We went through these gardens. I was in China a lot, having had the firm, so I knew a lot of the gardens. And my Chinese research colleague, a professor from China, also knew. So we were able to make these maps and the multisensorial gardens. But these are just some examples. But what I wanted to say is this is one of the research areas which I then later on was embedded in the book. And then we made these sense walk maps, which then indicate what the different experiences are in those gardens. And why do we do this? There's lots of them. But why do we do this? Is because we want to get the design student and obviously the client and the professional designer to be aware that you can't just design for sight. And that also is really important with recent research, let's say for neurodiversity, for people who have, let's say, autism, some condition who need a calm space, for example, less flash lighting, lots of sounds is not good. So it is important when we talk about inclusive design that we don't address it just for the general public, but we need to include all these other aspects. And these sound maps, for example, can help with this investigation. So the touch, and then we always looked at the different gardens again and described this. And I thought this would be interesting for you to see the depth of investigation. And you could do this with any garden, with an existing design you're doing for your studios, or as a professional, and then understand really what's going on in these gardens. I think that's an important aspect. But why it is also important is it really helps you to make design decisions much more, more rigorous in the way, for example, the choice of plants for touch or smell, the choice of the atmosphere you're trying to create being a multisensorial experience. By the way, this is the only textbook worldwide which talks about this. There's many articles, there's many researchers who've written a lot about this from a neurological point of view, from cognitive point of view on each individual sense, but not combining it and not how to teach it. So I did a first attempt of doing this with this book, which I'm going to show you in a minute as well. This is another article I wrote at the start of the pandemic. Gardens are buildings, where I argue that the garden is actually the first thing the designers should look at, because the building is in the garden or is in the landscape. The landscape shouldn't be an afterthought. The building is actually part of the landscape. And I think that is something which is always forgotten. And this article goes about that and starts ranking the, let's see, how to rank, for example, different kinds of buildings, and then look at the different garden activities. So it gives you a priority list. I did these kinds of matrices. So when you design, you start thinking about what these different outdoor spaces need to do, particularly in the pandemic, when the outdoor spaces in dense cities was the places to go. People realized, well, they can't be in buildings constantly. So that was a really important part in the discussion process of these peer-reviewed papers. And I use those also when the students had to design in the upper studios of the master degree, that they had started to reason their concepts. They not just wrote, well, I like it, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but that they have a bit of fodder, data fodder, or some information why they are doing what they're doing with the site. And these are some sketches. The ones on the left are from I drew, and the ones on the right are from a former student from Persia who draws very similar to me. We often work together in charrettes, and I employed her for the book to do these very consistent aerial drawings. And you can see here already by my conceptual drawings what the thought was, that the priority before architecture starts is actually the site and then the architecture, so that the outdoor space is the first thing we should be discussing, and how that relate, and how the architecture, the piece of building, is embedded on the site. It shouldn't be an afterthought. So a very important part. Now, I will briefly show you the cube method in these slides, what this is about. Then I'll show you a little short lecture on the book, how that got inspired. Then we will do a little exercise together, how the cube method is applied. And then online is a hand-drawn tutorial, a computer, analog and a digital tutorial, and an AI plugin tutorial where you can try it out in your own time. But basically, I argue for site investigation in first year of any design school, the axonometric is the best tool to use. And I have not invented it. This came, and I've just finished a peer-reviewed article for Yola. It's coming out next year for the history where the axonometric is from. It came from China via the Silk Road to Europe. They did find in diggings in Pompeii, in the mosaics in Italy, also axonometrics drawings. But what it is really about, it's a three-dimensional drawing, which is at scale at the front and the back compared to the 1-point and 2-point perspective, which is, as you know, in the background, the people are smaller. And so from a point of education, this is a really good tool to start. It's also so easy. You take the plan, you turn it, and then you have it three-dimensional. We do it together. But what I added is the following, that I argue around the site, and you can see this here. This is the site in the red square tilted of the site. And I argue that's not enough. And whenever you see in the 20th century, when the axonometric was used by architects and landscape architects, they only looked at their garden and their building, not enough the context. It was actually Ian McCarg who started using it in layering systems. And in my article, I talk about this. But what I argue, that when you have an axonometric, as you see here with a little river, is that you can make that smaller. And when you make the site smaller at different scale, you can expand the context. So you can look at the urban context. If you make the site bigger, you can look at the closer context. But the surrounding trees, the surrounding buildings, rivers, the grading of the land should be part of this investigation. So it's a three-dimensional investigation tool, very satisfying. As you can see here in blue is the groundwater table underneath. So you immediately can investigate when you draw all these things. You can question your local municipality. Where is the groundwater in Toronto? Where is it in Guelph? So you can immediately know what kind of trees, for example, you can then plant. And here you can see just a cube building, for example, or the site, and then how it responds to surrounding trees in context. You can then also draw a sun diagram and then know about the shape. But I'm just showing you just a couple of images, how that can be used for grading the land. And then again, if you grade the site, you need to know where the water flows from onto your site to actually really make design decisions. So you can see here clearly, if you go back, that's the site, and that's what has always been drawn. But I argue that's not enough. You need to draw the surrounding context to really respond. Microclimate, birds, wind, sun, underground critters, animals, anything. The site is not just the site. You can't just decide with the site alone. This is from the blog. This is the digital tool. You can see here how it is used and how it is designed, and then how a site design, and then how the surrounding site responds to the design. And what does this do? This tool helps you to ask questions, which I've just shown you in the matrices before. So the axonometric is like an X-ray tool, hand-drawn over the computer, to go to site and really investigate the site. So this is the first short, brief lecture. This is, by the way, my lab and my contact details. And we go right into the next lecture, and then I'm ready for questions. So this is the book, and this is a lecture I gave when I first introduced the book. And I think it's important to mention Michelle. She's a former graduate of ours. She helped me write this book. It was a 7-year process. And as you know, my research is on green roofs. I spent 20 years on green roof research. That lab still researches, but my real interest is pedagogy and tools. So if you go on the SALA website at UBC and Google open access tools on the search engine in the top, you will come to a site where I've posted all the open access tools I've developed, from landslide tools, from stormwater management tools, from investigation tools on water overall, on plants, on urban agriculture, and they're all open access and free for you. But I put this slide, nothing works on my own. I always work in a team, mostly small teams with highly qualified people. And Michelle is also helping again with the edits of the second book. And she was also instrumental in writing it. And then obviously there are students and researchers who help. This is a complex process. However, I also dedicated to the book to our most famous landscape architect in Canada, which is Cornelia Hahn-Oberländer, a German citizen who have had to flee Nazi Germany and then came to Canada in the 50s, and with her husband Peter Oberländer established a lot of landscape architecture as we know it today. She died sadly with 99 in 11 months, just at the end of the pandemic. This is one of the last images of her which I took, and I have dedicated the book to her. But what is important is obviously why am I doing this? So I grew up in southern Germany, and in the summers I spent, when my grandmother had this log cabin up in the Alps, my summers with the cows, 60 cows in the stable, and electric free, just gas-fired and wood-fired oven gas-fired lamps up in the mountains. And this now is the opposite. There's another building, après-ski, and it's all destroyed. But this is in the 60s. And this is the scale of the operation. This is the Stubai glaciers area, and it's near Innsbruck, and you may know Innsbruck because of the jumps, and Zaha Hadid designed the ski jump there. And I spent my youth there and learned very early on as a child in my lederhosen. And you can see a little little rope at the bottom and the hand of my mother making sure I'm not going to fall down the slopes. I learned very much early on to be respectful with the mountains and talk to them and don't do anything you shouldn't be doing. So I've always loved the mountains, but I'm very aware they can be very dangerous, and obviously because of climate change. But since my youth, I've been in the mountains, so I have had a lot of experience. But also, when I was up there, I played with water. And I played with water and realized it's a multisensorial experience. Touch, cold, smell. Water does smell. It's got a fresh smell. And it made me, as a child, already open-minded to the senses. It always fascinated since I was a child. And the other thing which fascinated me was art. My mother had an art gallery. My dad was an artist. My great-grandfather was an artist in the Viennese Secession. And so I come from a background of art. And what was unusual for a child when I was 13 or something was to draw abstract, inspired by the Bauhaus, which my mother exhibited. I write about it in my book. And these are some of my drawings. While I was in high school, everybody else was drawing realistic. I didn't. I drew abstract. And then when I went to university, that switched. These are some drawings of this abstract period. I've actually given a lecture at Guelph on my drawing, and I know it's on your YouTube channel, on Nadia's YouTube channel, if you want to listen to a longer version of this hand drawing experience lecture. There's a whole lecture, full lecture, which is well clicked on regularly. But these are just some of the images I drew when I was a high school kid. But then it was the experience in the United States, in Virginia, with a very famous landscape architect who was in his 80s, where I learned to hand draw. That was before computers. And the drawings were colored with pastel powder. And his name was Meade Palmer. He won every prize at the time an American could get in landscape architecture. Was educated at Cornell at the same time as many other famous landscape architects. And then after the war, since 47, run his studio. So I had a really good master to learn from. And then after my education, or while I interned in Japan and stayed 3 years, and one of my interests was green roofs. And I got inspired by this because I was able to do amazing. This is a Shinkansen station in Sapporo in northern Japan, where we developed with an engineer and a recent graduate from the AA who came back to Japan, this very big high-speed train station, and I designed the green roof. But you can see also I was this was really early. I was still a student. These are aerial perspectives and then eye-level perspectives. But here you can see already this is complex. An eye-level perspective is distorted, while like an aerial from above literally looks like an axonometric, although this is actually a two-point aerial perspective. You get a much better experience. So it's the time I started using drawing also as a communication tool, because my Japanese wasn't that strong at the time. And then after my 3 years in Japan, I registered as a landscape architect in Berlin, and the unification had happened. This is at the area where the wall was. And I was asked by my two bosses who didn't speak English, who were in Stuttgart, I worked for, to manage and run a small office and build with Renzo Piano, who was the master planner, in these 17 buildings adjacent to the National Library here by Hans Scharoun, from the very famous architect who also built the Philharmonics. And at the bottom, you see a bit of the Helmut Jahn building with Sony, with Peter Walker. but I was in charge of the green roofs and the gardens. And that big project then inspired me to go into landscape architecture, and then also have my own firm, as you can see here when I started out quite a while ago now. Look at the big screens, the big computer screens, so you know how old this is. And my ink drawings, still by hand. I used the computer. I was quite aware that was necessary, but I did all my thinking exercises by hand. These are some drawings, competition drawings, where I used hand drawing, and then we used Photoshop at the time. That was quite advanced. This is at 23 years old. Drawings that they looked like watercolors for projects. And then I also worked on the Olympic sailing club in China, and that's how I got connected to China and then worked with people there. But again, here I'm showing this to show you communication. Again, visual communication, hand drawing is so fast. It's a really good language, and now with AI, even faster. But I'm showing you these drawings because it's important to see where I'm coming from. And as you can see in the quality of the drawing, they are very reduced and only focus on things already telling about the multisensorial experiences, even though I, at the time, hadn't written the book. Because I only draw what is necessary, the texture of the wall, the leaves of the trees, the shadow underneath the forest. So all, which calls cooling microclimate. So all multisensorial experiences. And then when I was in China a lot traveling, the smellscape of the street food, all that inspired, and I realized environmental design, landscape architecture, anything outside the building structure is a multisensorial experience. But how do we visualize it? How do we teach it? So of course, conventional teaching, this is a few years back in our undergrad degree, I'm teaching perspective drawing, and we had a lot of fun. All these former students are now landscape architects. This is like 15 years ago, but I thought I'd show you how I started to use my thinking in the classroom, but also working with my colleague Patrick Condon, emeritus professor, recently retired, who developed the charrette system. This is a visualization of North Vancouver in 100 years. And you can see this on, look at the ships, they have sails. This is now quite a while ago, but I still like this drawing to communicate green roofs, solar cells, to communicate new building methods. And this is another one, another charrette in Surrey, also in British Columbia. They are kind of axonometric drawings, a multisensorial investigation tool. And these experiences, looking at contextual design at the urban scale, that's what made the cube method happen. So it was those experiences drawing these ideas that I realized the best way to communicate to clients and to students, and also teaching them, is the axonometric, because the perspective, the 2-point perspective, what this is much more complicated. But the axonometric helps to teach it very easily. Then I wrote in my first sabbatical, when I wrote my first book on green roofs, in the evenings I wrote a cookbook, because I like cooking and I use different kinds of cultures, the Western Italian culture with the Asian culture, and I developed these recipes, and I had a lot of fun. And to keep sane while writing a peer-reviewed scientific book on a highly engineered and mathematical book, I had to do something else, and I used the drawing as for mental healing. And then obviously also the pandemic arrived, and then using the iPad, I realized in the pandemic, which I'm doing with you right now, that this is a really powerful tool to teach. And so the students don't fall asleep, because I'm not in the classroom. I'm a couple of thousand kilometers away from you. But with the iPad, and we will do it in a minute, I can animate my drawing. So it's not all just PowerPoints. That I have already explained. But then the drawing, the multisensorial drawing process, either by sketchbook or by hand in the landscape, that is something which then started that process of recording the senses. And that's why I always teach the senses together with the axonometric and with the analog drawing. And I'm a visual learner. 40% of students are visual learners like me. 60% are text learners. I learn visually. So this is hand drawings of my first ideas how to develop a method to rank the different senses and how to design inclusively, for example, for a person who is visually or hearing impaired, what are the most important parts to think of. And these are some of the drawings, and this is just one of them to see. And then here is the ranking system, which you've seen before. And then another one of those observation and perception drawings, which I've shown you before, but this time just looking at a strawberry, for example, and what happens in the process, in the cognitive process, or the one I've shown before for the landscape. And then in the book, I lay out different exercises, and one of them I've described briefly before is the SINS walk mapping, and I've shown you the journal articles. You can read about it. And this is to learn about the experience. You can use an existing site in Guelph, you can go there, annotate it, investigate. But it is not just about what you hear. You have to use it. Otherwise, it's a survey. You're just basically recording it. That's not what the exercise. The exercise is to record it and then to analyze it. What will it do for my project? Let's say muffled sound. Do I want to heighten the sound? Do I want to open up a hedge so the sound comes in so that you don't feel so lonely? Or the opposite, do I want to make a wall or a much more dense hedge that you muffle the sound to feel in solitude alone? So it's kind of this analytical thinking which is important. And here are these publications I mentioned in my first talk. And there's also a German write-up about that as well. And this is the map when my students in the undergrad go outside and have to investigate sites. And this year I enhanced it and I said, I want you to take this further, not just high, medium, low. You can use AI, you can look at different people, how they evaluate things, how they measure things, and they came up with really good ideas which are available on our blog. And at the end of the year, I can send you guys the link as well. But what I coined this whole process is from visual literacy, how we were taught in the 80s when I was a student, to multisensorial literacy. So I think that's a really important message for you to see. And how that process then works. This is an example. Here's a chair, and the person is sitting on the chair or investigating it. But if the person, for example, is visually impaired and can't see the chair, what is the most important? Maybe it is actually not like the first icon of the eye, this side. Maybe it's the second one, touch. Maybe it's the sound that chair makes when you touch it. Maybe it's the smell of the chair because it's made out of wood, a specific cedar wood. So you can see already in my design process, when you read the book, these are the original drawings when I invented this kind of formula, how we design multisensorially, but also inclusive. If you say, oh yeah, the wheelchair to access the building, that is not inclusive design, that's accessible design. Inclusive design is if one of your senses is completely not working or partially working. For example, the ear or the eye. You can't see. So if you can't see the chair, the form of the chair, which we as architects find so important, well, what if you are visually impaired? What is important? Maybe the touch of it. So I developed priority lists for that. So this is when I started developing these priority lists. And then out of that, and that's all in the book, I started the synthesizing process. And then that obviously doesn't, and here you can see it from the book draft, then how it then pans out in the exercises in the book. And you can see, depending for whom the chair is, if it's private, you can decide what you want. But if it's public and we really want to be inclusive, well, then touches is important. Because obviously, if you can't see the chair, but you have to feel it to actually sit on it and feel comfortable, then maybe touch. The priority of touch is very important. The same goes with, for example, if you are visually impaired and you want to pour yourself a cup of hot water, coffee or tea. Well, how would you do that? So if you design a cup with a thinner area where you can, when you pour the hot water in it, you can fill when it's full, maybe that is a way to design it. So I developed these exercises for students, for example, to draw blindfolded an object, or we went outside to draw blindfolded the landscape. And then they realized, oh my God, that's a real issue. Or then you can go up in the scale into the landscape. So this is my drawing how a landscape, a pocket park, if you're visually impaired, the walking on the gravel, the sound of the gravel, and the touch of the gravel, the surface, and the smell of the garden may be more important than the visual aspect or the sound of it, particularly if you can't see. So I started to really go deep, and these are just some of the original drawings. And then this is from the book, how that it panned out. Why I'm showing you this is a process, like designing. My whole life is a process. It's not just going up. It's up and down. It's doubts. And when you design, it's a process. There are failures. There are positive parts. And you need to have patience and persistence, like Cornelia Hahn-Oberländer says, and professionalism to actually, and passion to actually achieve good landscape architecture. So this is the layout, how to investigate this. And then I gave, this is an old one now, but I've given 5, 6 seminars, very popular with architects and landscape architects, and the blogs are available online. This is one of them, where they investigate, through the book exercises, the landscape multisensorial. This is, for example, drawn blind scissors. And then this is an example, I think, of a stair, the movement on a stair. So they also use GIFs, but you see, this is already 5, 6 years old. Now with the new advances in AI, we can do it even better. But why I'm showing you this is to get you inspired. This is, for example, the tongue and the taste. So we went to one market and we ate food. And how would you document the food? But not document it only, analyze it. So the documentation is where, for example, on the tongue, you taste what? And then the graph is the analysis, for example, which taste is stronger than another. And that is a really important part. Or this one is one of my favorites, is an old one. Let's see if it works. This is a multisensorial experience where a student documents the peeling of an orange, but not round and visually clear, but by the layers. So a very interesting exercise and something I want you to think of and explore. So, and then at the end of this seminar, on the last day in class, we sketched, they had to do, this is an older one, a summary of the seminar. Well, what's the future? This is a very old sketch I drew many years ago. I call it, it's the hedge. Hold on, can I see? Maybe we can see Hedge Gate. Yeah, that's what the title was. Hedge Gate, made out of hedges and seeing into the landscape. Well, I think the last 3 years has had dramatic shifts, not just because of open access chat GTV, but also the machine learning has extensively changed the whole perception where it's going. And that's why I'm doing the second edition of the book. But don't despair. I would say see it as a encouragement, because now we can do less of the tedious work. The computer can do that, or the machine can do that, while we can then spend more time on seeing the projects, conceptual design, and engaging with the site much more than in the past at the beginning. And this is here very important. I always go out. This is a very popular undergrad course where we engage with local projects, do stormwater management, exploration, and then they have to draw it and visualize it, because obviously landscape architecture is a holistic system thinking exercise. And this is just me giving some instructions. And I always say, this is one of my colleagues, which you all should know, Roehr. He's done a really good movie. I saw it last year on his drawing, took 10 years to make, on his hand drawing. Drawing can't be taught, but it can be learned. So my job is not to teach it to you. You have to do that yourself. It's like playing the piano. It's like learning tennis. It's a skill, but it can be learned, and we can give you inspiration. So that is that. And I open it up to questions. We have a few minutes break, little